The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and old paper, a scent that had become terrifyingly familiar to 8-year-old Emma over the past few months. She sat on an uncomfortable wooden bench, her small legs swinging slightly because they didn't quite reach the floor, her fingers twisted so tightly around Max's collar that her knuckles had turned white. The golden retriever beside her remained perfectly still, as if he understood the gravity of this moment. His warm, honey-colored fur provided the only comfort in an otherwise cold and sterile environment. Emma leaned her head against his neck, breathing in his familiar scent, a mixture of dog shampoo and home, the only two things that still made sense to her anymore. It had been 6 months since everything fell apart. 6 months since her father had packed a suitcase and left, slamming the front door so hard that the family photo above the hallway table had fallen and shattered across the hardwood floor. Emma had stared at the broken glass, watching her smiling face, captured during happier times, crack into a dozen jagged pieces. She'd wanted to scream then, but instead, she'd picked up the pieces silently and swept them into the trash. That was when her mother had brought Max home. "He's going to help you through this," her mother had whispered, kneeling beside her on the kitchen floor. Emma hadn't understood then what that meant, but now, 6 months later, she couldn't imagine surviving without him. The past half-year had been a blur of confusion and pain. There were the angry phone calls between her parents, voices raised so loud that Emma would lock herself in her bedroom with her hands over her ears, trying desperately to block out the words that cut deeper than any blade. She'd heard her father accusing her mother of being controlling and manipulative. She'd heard her mother's voice, broken and desperate, saying she was only protecting Emma. The words didn't make sense to her. They were adults' words, legal words, words that belonged to lawyers and courthouses, not to the family she'd thought was permanent and unbreakable. School had become impossible. Emma, who used to raise her hand first in math class and volunteer for every reading assignment, now stared blankly at the blackboard while her teacher's voice became a distant hum. During lunch, she sat alone in the cafeteria, pushing her food around her tray without actually eating anything. Her best friend, Sophie, had tried to sit with her a few times, but Emma had nothing to say. How could she explain the custody battle? How could she explain that her parents were fighting over her like she was a prize to be won rather than a daughter to be loved? Eventually, Sophie stopped trying, and Emma found herself increasingly isolated, trapped inside her own spiraling thoughts. Her appetite had vanished almost overnight. Her mother had mentioned it at the last checkup with their pediatrician. "She's lost 5 pounds, she'd said, concern evident in her voice. Emma remembered the doctor's gentle examination, the way he'd asked if she was feeling okay, as if she could possibly articulate the suffocating weight pressing down on her chest every single day. She'd shaken her head silently. The doctor had prescribed nothing. There was nothing to prescribe for a broken family. The worst part was the insomnia. Night after night, Emma would lie in her bed, staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to quiet her mind. She'd replay conversations, trying to understand what she'd done to cause all this chaos. Had she been too demanding, too expensive? Had she somehow driven her father away? The rational part of her brain, the part that hadn't been traumatized by 6 months of parental conflict, knew that it wasn't her fault, but the frightened, 8-year-old part of her held onto guilt like a security blanket, convinced that if she'd only been better somehow, her family would still be whole. That was when Max truly became her salvation. On the nights when Emma couldn't sleep, when her anxiety spiraled into dark places, Max would somehow sense it. He'd pad into her bedroom in the darkness and jump onto her bed, settling his warm body against hers. His presence was like an anchor, keeping her tethered to reality when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. She discovered that if she focused entirely on his breathing, matching her own breath to the rise and fall of his chest, her panic would gradually subside. They developed rituals together, little signals and movements that only they understood. A circular motion with her hand, a specific whisper. Max knew exactly what each gesture meant, and he'd respond with the calming techniques he'd been trained for, as if he and Emma had their own secret language that transcended the chaos of the adult world. Emma's mother had noticed the transformation. After weeks of watching Emma decline, her mother had seen a subtle but real improvement once Max arrived. It wasn't magic, but it was close. Emma started sleeping a bit better. She'd occasionally eat an entire sandwich. She even managed a small smile when Max did something silly. The school counselor had been amazed at the difference a therapy dog could make. Emma's grades improved slightly. She participated in class a few times. She wasn't healed, she was far from healed, but she was surviving. And right now, survival felt like the greatest victory imaginable. But today was different. Today was the final custody hearing. Today, a judge would sit in her elevated chair and make a decision that would completely alter the trajectory of Emma's life. Would she live with her mother and stay in her school, in her home, with her friends? Or would she be forced to split her time, moving back and forth between two houses, two lives, two versions of herself? The uncertainty was suffocating. As they'd driven to the courthouse this morning, Emma had held Max so tightly that her mother had gently reminded her not to strangle the dog. But Emma couldn't let go. Max was the only solid thing in her world right now, the only being who loved her unconditionally without expecting anything in return. Now, sitting in this hallway outside the courtroom, Emma's hands trembled as she gripped Max's collar. Her heart raced with a panic that no amount of deep breathing seemed to calm. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she didn't fully believe in anymore. "Please, Max, be with me. Please help me get through this." Max turned his head and licked her face gently, his dark eyes full of a wisdom and compassion that seemed impossible for a dog to possess. Emma knew that whatever happened in that courtroom today, at least she wouldn't be facing it alone. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom loomed before Emma like the entrance to a monster's lair. Her mother placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but Emma could feel the tremor in it. Her mother was nervous too. The courthouse hallway, which had already seemed intimidating and foreign, suddenly felt like a safe harbor compared to what lay beyond those imposing doors. Emma's stomach twisted into knots so complicated that she wondered if they would ever untie themselves. Max pressed against her left leg, as if he could sense the catastrophic levels of anxiety radiating from her small body. She took a deep breath, squeezed her eyes shut for just a moment, and then her mother gently pulled the door open. The courtroom was nothing like Emma had imagined. The walls were a deep mahogany wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of heavy solemnity and consequence. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Everything smelled like old wood, leather-bound books, and something else Emma couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was the scent of justice itself, she thought grimly. Or perhaps it was just the smell of fear. The room was rectangular, with the judge's bench elevated at the far end like a throne. Below it sat the court clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, her fingers poised over a keyboard as if she was about to type out the verdict for Emma's entire future. Judge sat behind that imposing bench, and Emma's breath caught in her throat. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore the traditional black robe of her office, which made her seem even more powerful and unapproachable. Her expression was completely neutral, giving nothing away. Emma had never seen a face so devoid of emotion, and it terrified her. How could this stranger, this woman who had never met her before, possibly understand what was best for her future? How could someone so stern and cold make decisions about love and family? Emma's father was already seated at one of the tables on the right side of the courtroom, his expensive gray suit perfectly pressed, his tie a deep navy blue. He looked confident, almost smug, as if he was absolutely certain that he would win this case. Beside him sat his lawyer, a tall man with slick-back hair and an expression that Emma could only describe as predatory. The lawyer was already shuffling through papers, preparing his arguments, readying his weapons for the battle ahead. Emma's mother guided her to the opposite table on the left, and Emma sat down slowly, her legs feeling weak and unreliable. The courtroom was filling up with people. Other lawyers, court officials, and various administrative staff moved around with an efficiency that suggested they did this every single day. For them, this was just another case, another custody battle, another family torn apart by legal procedures and arguments. But for Emma, this was the entirety of her world collapsing. She wondered if any of these people ever thought about the children at the center of these cases, or if they'd become so accustomed to the chaos that they no longer saw the human cost of their work. Emma's mother squeezed her hand gently. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, though Emma could hear the doubt in her voice. Her mother was trying to be strong for her, but Emma was old enough to recognize fear when she saw it. Her mother was terrified that the judge would side with Emma's father. She was terrified of losing her daughter to some custody arrangement that would tear apart the last remaining threads of their family. The anxiety radiating from her mother only amplified Emma's own panic. Max remained perfectly calm, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes tracked every movement in the courtroom. The therapy dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than most of the humans present. Emma ran her fingers through his golden fur, finding comfort in the familiar texture. She wondered what Max thought about all of this. Did he understand that they might be separated? Did he comprehend that custody battles could result in Emma being taken away from the only home she'd ever known? The judge looked up from her papers and surveyed the courtroom with an expression that suggested she was sizing everyone up, making quick judgments about character and credibility based on appearances alone. When her gaze landed on Emma, the girl felt as if she was being examined under a microscope. Emma looked down quickly, unable to maintain eye contact with such an intimidating presence. She wished she could disappear, become invisible, float away from this nightmare. The bailiff called the case to order, versus custody matter. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma's father's lawyer stood first, straightening his jacket with a gesture that seemed designed to intimidate. He began to speak in a smooth, practiced voice, presenting his arguments about why Emma's father was the more capable parent. He used words like financial stability, work ethic, and parental rights. Emma didn't fully understand all of his arguments, but she recognized the underlying message. Her father was better. Her father was more qualified. Her father should have her. Emma felt her chest tightening. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed impossibly bright, almost painfully so. The voices of the lawyers, the judge, the court clerk, they all seemed to be coming from very far away, as if Emma was listening through water. She gripped Max's collar, her knuckles turning white again. This was really happening. These strangers in suits were actually going to decide her entire future. They would determine where she slept at night, which school she attended, how much time she spent with each parent. And there was nothing she could do about it. She had no say, no voice, no power. The room began to spin slightly. Emma's breathing became shallow and rapid. Her vision started to blur at the edges. She could feel panic building in her chest like a pressure cooker about to explode. Max's head came up suddenly, and he pressed closer against her, but for the first time since they'd entered the courtroom, even his presence didn't seem like enough to save her from the crushing weight of anxiety that was consuming her. Emma's mother noticed her distress and placed a protective arm around her shoulders, but even that maternal comfort couldn't stop the avalanche of terror that was overwhelming her. As her father's lawyer continued his arguments, painting a picture of a negligent mother and a capable, caring father, which bore no resemblance to reality, Emma felt like she was drowning. The courtroom, which had seemed merely intimidating moments before, now felt like a cage with no escape route. She was trapped, vulnerable, and utterly powerless. As the hearing progressed deeper into the morning, Emma felt herself slipping further away from reality, as if she was watching her own life unfold from outside her body. Her father's lawyer continued his relentless assault on her mother's character, painting her as emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, and fundamentally incapable of providing the structured environment that a child needed. With each accusation, Emma felt her chest constrict a little more, her breathing becoming shallower and more labored. These allegations were complete fabrications. Her mother was none of these things. Her mother had held their family together through impossible circumstances. But in this courtroom, truth seemed to matter less than rhetoric and persuasive argument. The father has demonstrated consistent financial responsibility, the lawyer droned on, gesturing toward Emma's father, who nodded solemnly as if agreeing with his own manufactured narrative. He maintains a prestigious position at a major accounting firm. His income significantly exceeds that of the mother. Furthermore, the father has expressed a willingness to provide Emma with the finest education money can afford: private school, tutoring, extracurricular activities. The mother, on the other hand, works in a modest position as a school administrator, struggling to make ends meet. Can she truly provide the stability and opportunity that a child deserves? Emma's hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The lawyer's words twisted inside her mind, creating a narrative that felt both completely false and terrifyingly persuasive. Money didn't matter to her. She didn't need private school or fancy tutoring. All she wanted was her mother, her home, and her dog. But how could she explain that to a judge who seemed to care only about financial statements and professional credentials? Her mother's lawyer then stood to present their side, her voice firm but lacking the aggressive confidence of the opposition. The mother has been the primary caregiver since Emma's infancy. She has maintained consistent employment, managed all household responsibilities, and demonstrated an unwavering commitment to her daughter's emotional and psychological well-being. The lawyer gestured toward Emma and Max. The presence of the therapy dog speaks volumes about the mother's dedication to supporting Emma through this difficult transition. The child is thriving emotionally under her care. But even as her mother's lawyer spoke, Emma could see that something was wrong. She could see it in the way Judge's eyes flickered toward Emma's father with what might have been approval. She could see it in the knowing glance exchanged between the judge and her father's lawyer, as if there was an unspoken understanding between them, a agreement that the wealthier, more professionally accomplished parent should prevail. Emma's vision began to blur slightly, and she realized she wasn't blinking. She couldn't remember how to blink. The courtroom felt as if it was gradually closing in on her, the walls moving inward with glacial slowness, the ceiling lowering imperceptibly. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed impossibly bright, each one a small sun burning directly into her retinas. The air felt thick and difficult to breathe, as if all the oxygen was being systematically removed from the room. Emma's lungs worked harder, pulling in air that felt insufficient, that didn't contain enough oxygen to sustain her. She was suffocating while surrounded by people, while sitting in a public space, unable to cry out because that might make things worse for her mother. Her father leaned back in his chair with a confident smile, completely assured of his victory. That smile, that infuriating, arrogant smile, sent a spike of pure panic through Emma's body. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that money couldn't buy love, that fancy schools couldn't replace the warmth of her mother's embrace, that he was a liar and a fraud. But she remained silent, paralyzed by anxiety and the oppressive formality of the courtroom. Emma's heart began to race at an alarming speed. She could feel every individual beat, each one hammering against her ribs as if trying to escape. Her chest tightened until breathing became a conscious, deliberate effort. She had to remind herself to inhale, to exhale, to continue the basic biological function that she'd been doing automatically for 8 years. Sweat began to bead on her forehead and palms. She felt simultaneously burning hot and freezing cold, as if her body couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. Beside her, Max's entire demeanor shifted. The therapy dog, who had been relaxed and calm just moments before, suddenly became intensely focused. His ears perked up, his body tensed, his eyes locked onto Emma with an intensity that suggested he was reading her internal state like a book written in a language only he could understand. Max had been specifically trained to recognize panic attacks and anxiety disorders, and he was detecting the unmistakable signs that Emma was descending into a psychological crisis. Emma's mother noticed her daughter's distress and leaned down, whispering, "Sweetheart, just breathe. It's going to be okay." But Emma couldn't breathe normally. She couldn't slow her racing heart. She couldn't stop the sensation that the walls were literally closing in on her, that she was being crushed by the weight of adult decisions and legal proceedings that she was powerless to influence. The judge was reading from documents now, occasionally looking up at Emma's father with an expression that seemed decidedly sympathetic. That expression, that terrible, terrible expression, told Emma everything she needed to know. The judge had already made up her mind. Her father had won. She would be torn away from her mother, forced to live with a man who smelled like expensive cologne and broken promises, a man who had abandoned her without hesitation just 6 months ago. The reality of that future crashed down on her like a physical force. Emma's small body began to shake visibly. Tears started to stream down her face, though she didn't remember them beginning. She made an effort to stifle her sobs, pressing her lips together so hard they turned white, but the physical symptoms of her panic attack were impossible to hide. Her breathing became rapid and gasping, like someone drowning in air. Max rose to his feet smoothly, his trained instincts overriding everything else. He could sense that Emma was in genuine distress, that this wasn't simple nervousness but a full-blown panic attack threatening to overwhelm her fragile 8-year-old psyche. The therapy dog's muscles tensed, preparing to respond to his girl's crisis. His eyes never left Emma's face, monitoring her deteriorating state with the fierce dedication of a guardian angel given canine form. Emma felt the panic becoming all-consuming, a tsunami of terror and despair that threatened to pull her under completely. She gripped Max's collar with both hands now, her only anchor to sanity in a courtroom that had become a nightmare made manifest. The walls continued to close in. Emma's mind, fractured by anxiety and fear, suddenly zeroed in on the one thing she knew could save her: Max. Not the courtroom, not the judge, not her parents or their lawyers, just Max. In the depths of her panic, in that moment when she felt most alone and most abandoned, she remembered the ritual they had developed together. It had started accidentally, almost by accident, on a night 3 months ago when she couldn't sleep and everything inside her felt like it was breaking apart. That night, Emma had been lying in her bed in the darkness, her mind racing with 1,000 terrible thoughts about her parents' separation. She'd been crying silently, not wanting to disturb her mother, when Max had come into her room and jumped onto the bed beside her. In her desperation, her hand had unconsciously moved in a circular motion near Max's side, a gesture that came from somewhere deep within her subconscious, some primal need to create connection, to establish a physical link between herself and the one being in her life that seemed to understand her without words. Max had responded instantly. The therapy dog seemed to understand that this circular motion was a signal, a request for something specific. He had begun to move his body in synchronization with the motion, creating a rhythm that forced Emma's erratic breathing to slow and match his own steady pattern. Her racing heartbeat had gradually synchronized with his, her panic slowly releasing its grip on her throat. The motion, combined with Max's presence and his trained calming techniques, had created something magical, a shared language between girl and dog that transcended the need for words. They had repeated this ritual hundreds of times since that first night. On nights when insomnia plagued Emma, when nightmares about her fractured family jolted her awake in cold sweats, when the anxiety became so overwhelming that she wanted to scream, Emma would make that circular motion, and Max would respond with his entire being. It was as if they had discovered a secret frequency that only the two of them could access, a channel of communication that allowed Emma to transmit her distress and receive comfort in return. Now, sitting in the courtroom, feeling the walls closing in and her sanity slipping away, Emma desperately needed that connection. Her hand moved almost of its own volition, the circular gesture becoming her lifeline, her SOS signal to the one being in the world who might actually understand what she needed. Her fingers traced that invisible circle near Max's shoulder, the motion so subtle that no one watching would have noticed anything unusual. To an outside observer, it might have looked like she was simply petting her dog, a nervous habit to cope with stress. But Max knew. Max understood with absolute certainty that Emma was signaling him, calling out to him across the chasm of human chaos and legal proceedings, begging him to be present with her in a way that no human could possibly understand. The therapy dog's entire body language changed instantaneously. His casual alertness transformed into focused intensity. Every muscle in his golden frame seemed to quiver with purpose. Emma repeated the signal, her hand moving in that circular pattern again and again, growing more desperate with each repetition. She leaned down close to Max's ear and whispered so softly that even her mother couldn't hear her, the words barely audible above the drone of the lawyer's arguments. "Help me, boy. Please help me." It was a prayer and a plea, a cry for rescue from the emotional abyss threatening to consume her. The circular motion continued, almost meditative in its repetition. Emma's mind began to focus on nothing but that movement, the feel of Max's fur beneath her fingertips, the warmth of his body against her leg. Around her, the courtroom continued its proceedings. She could hear her father's lawyer making another argument about parental fitness and financial resources. She could hear her mother's lawyer responding, voice sharp with frustration at the obvious bias in the judge's demeanor. But these sounds existed in a distant sphere now, separated from Emma by the bubble of connection she and Max had created together. This ritual, this secret language they had developed, represented something far more profound than a simple calming technique. It was a manifestation of the bond between them, a connection that had been forged in the crucible of Emma's emotional devastation and Max's unwavering dedication to her well-being. It was the physical expression of unconditional love, of presence without judgment, of commitment without reservation. When Emma made that circular motion, she was saying, "I need you. Please don't leave me, please help me survive this." And Max in his response was answering, "I'm here, I see you, I will always be here." Emma's whispered words became a mantra, repeated over and over like an incantation designed to ward off evil. "Help me, boy. Help me, boy. Help me, boy." Each repetition of the circular motion, each whisper, each press of her forehead against Max's neck represented another thread in the rope she was using to climb out of the abyss of her panic attack. The gesture was so simple, so subtle, that it seemed impossible that it could have such profound effects. But Emma had learned, through countless nights of practice, that sometimes the most powerful medicine comes in the smallest packages. She thought about how they had discovered this ritual together, how Max had somehow intuitively understood what she needed even before she fully understood it herself. That first night when he'd responded to her unconscious circular motion, Emma had realized that she and Max shared something special, a language more complex than barks and commands, a system of communication that operated on a deeper level of consciousness and need. Since then, Emma had deliberately refined the signal. She'd experimented with different motions, different pressures, different speeds. She discovered that if she made the circle in one direction, Max would respond by turning his body against her leg in a specific way that grounded her. If she varied the motion slightly, Max would adjust his positioning accordingly. It was as if they had a conversation without words, a dialogue conducted entirely through physical gesture and intuitive understanding. Now, in the most terrifying moment of her life, with a judge deciding her future and her father smiling his terrible smile, Emma relied entirely on this secret language. Her hand continued the circular motion, slower now, more deliberate, drawing from reserves of calm that she didn't know she possessed. The gesture was barely visible to anyone watching, just a small girl petting her dog while listening to lawyers debate her fate. But it was everything. It was her anchor, her lifeline, her reason to believe that she might actually survive this day without completely shattering into irreparable pieces. The circular motion continued, steady and hypnotic, a rhythm of survival and love written in a language that only Emma and Max understood. Judge had been presiding over family law cases for 32 years, and in that time, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read human behavior. She could detect lies in the subtle twitch of a witness's eye, interpret desperation in the careful way a mother gripped her purse, and recognize genuine emotion beneath layers of performative presentation. It was this skill, honed through decades of observing human nature at its most vulnerable, that caused her to notice something in the courtroom that morning that made her pause mid-thought, even as the father's lawyer continued his relentless assault on the mother's credibility. The judge had been reading through the custody evaluation documents, occasionally glancing up at the proceedings before her, when something in her peripheral vision caught her attention. It was subtle, so subtle that most people would have missed it entirely. But Judge was not most people. She noticed the small girl in the gallery making a repetitive hand motion, a circular gesture that seemed almost ritualistic in nature. The motion was barely perceptible, the kind of movement that would barely register on a casual observer, but the judge's trained eyes detected the precision and intention behind it. What struck Judge most profoundly, however, was not the gesture itself, but the dog's instantaneous response. She watched as the golden retriever's entire demeanor shifted from relaxed passivity to focused intensity. The dog seemed to understand something, to recognize a signal that was laden with meaning. The therapy dog pressed closer against the girl, his body language transforming into something that suggested protective urgency. Judge found herself leaning forward slightly in her chair, her attention pulled entirely away from the papers before her and the lawyer's continuing arguments. The judge observed the girl's face, and what she saw there disturbed her deeply. Even from her elevated position behind the bench, Judge could detect the signs of significant psychological distress. The girl's face was pale, almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent lighting. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her pupils dilated in what the judge recognized as the classic physical manifestation of acute anxiety. The girl's breathing appeared shallow and irregular, her small chest rising and falling in a pattern that suggested she was struggling to process oxygen. Her hands trembled slightly as they moved in that circular pattern, and Judge could see the white knuckles where the girl was gripping the dog's collar. More disturbing than the girl's obvious distress was the lack of response from the court officers and administrators around them. Everyone else seemed completely oblivious to the fact that a child in their courtroom was experiencing what appeared to be a significant psychological crisis. The lawyers continued their arguments, the court clerk continued typing, and no one seemed to notice that the small girl in the gallery was literally falling apart in real time. Judge had seen many children in her courtroom over the decades. She had witnessed angry children, confused children, sad children, and traumatized children. But she had learned to distinguish between the performance of distress and genuine emotional breakdown. What she was observing now was decidedly the latter. This child was not simply nervous or upset about the proceedings. This child was experiencing something deeper, something more profound, a genuine panic attack or anxiety crisis that was threatening to overwhelm her fragile 8-year-old psyche. The judge watched as the girl leaned down and whispered something to the dog, her lips moving so minimally that the words were completely inaudible even to those sitting relatively close to her. But the dog understood. The golden retriever seemed to comprehend every syllable of whatever private communication was passing between them. The dog pressed his body even more firmly against the girl, and Judge observed something remarkable. The dog began to move in a rhythmic, deliberate pattern, almost as if he was deliberately attempting to synchronize his physical presence with the girl's distressed state. Judge's years of family law experience suddenly crystallized into a moment of profound clarity. She recognized that what she was witnessing was not mere distraction or fidgeting. It was a sophisticated form of therapeutic communication between a trained service animal and a child in crisis. The circular hand motion, the whispered words, the dog's trained response, these were not random behaviors. They were components of a carefully developed system of emotional regulation and crisis intervention. The girl and her dog had clearly practiced this ritual many times before, and they were employing it now because the psychological stress of the courtroom proceedings had triggered a crisis response in the child. Judge felt something shift inside her, a visceral recognition that something vitally important was happening, something that transcended the legal arguments being presented before her. This was not just another custody case with competing financial credentials and professional accomplishments. This was a child in genuine distress, communicating through her dog because words seemed insufficient to express the magnitude of her emotional pain. The judge's attention was no longer divided. She was no longer reading documents or passively listening to arguments. Every fiber of her professional focus was now concentrated on the girl in the gallery and the remarkable therapy dog beside her. Judge watched as the girl's whispered words continued, as the circular motion remained consistent and deliberate, as the dog responded with the kind of intuitive understanding that seemed to transcend normal animal behavior. The judge suddenly became aware that the lawyer for the father was mid-sentence, continuing to argue about financial capabilities and professional accomplishments while, directly in her courtroom, an 8-year-old child was experiencing what appeared to be a severe panic attack. The disconnect between what the lawyer was saying and what was actually happening in the courtroom was so stark, so jarring, that Judge felt a surge of frustration. She looked at the girl again, noted the grayish tinge to her face, the way her breathing had become even more shallow and irregular, the way her entire body seemed to be trembling. The judge recognized that if this continued, the girl might pass out or suffer some kind of significant medical event. Something had to stop. This proceeding had to pause. The judge could not, in good conscience, continue this hearing while a child was suffering in her courtroom. Judge raised her hand slowly, her expression becoming stern and authoritative. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through the courtroom like a knife through silk, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. "Stop," Judge commanded, her single word hanging in the air like a gavel strike waiting to happen. The lawyer stopped mid-sentence, his mouth opening and closing like a fish removed from water. All eyes turned toward the judge. "I'm calling a 15-minute recess." She looked directly at the girl in the gallery, her gaze penetrating and genuine. "We will reconvene in 15 minutes. I need to understand what's happening here." The judge's gavel struck the bench with finality, and the sound echoed through the courtroom like a bell announcing a fundamental shift in the trajectory of this case. Judge had seen something that afternoon that transcended legal arguments and financial statements. She had witnessed something real, something human, something that reminded her why she had become a judge in the first place, not to maximize the income of wealthy parents, but to protect the best interests of children. And right now, a child in her courtroom desperately needed protection. The moment Judge's gavel struck the bench with that authoritative finality, something shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. It was as if a pressure valve had been released, a momentary pause in the relentless proceedings that had been suffocating Emma. The judge's command for a recess created a temporary sanctuary, a brief respite from the assault of legal arguments and paternal confidence. But for Emma, that 15-minute recess felt both like an eternity and an instant compressed into a single moment. The instant the judge raised her hand and began to speak, Max seemed to understand that this was the moment of greatest crisis. The therapy dog's entire body transformed into an instrument of purpose and determination. He rose to his feet with a smooth, practiced motion that belied the intensity of his focus. His golden fur seemed to shimmer under the courtroom lights as every muscle in his powerful frame tensed with deliberate intention. Max was no longer simply a pet providing companionship. He was a highly trained professional responding to the emergency signals from the girl he loved with every fiber of his being. Emma's panic attack had reached its crescendo during the judge's interruption. Her breathing had become so rapid and shallow that she was nearly hyperventilating, her small chest heaving with the effort of trying to pull sufficient oxygen into her lungs. Her vision had become tunnel-like, focusing on Max, while the rest of the courtroom seemed to exist in a blur of colors and shapes. Her heart was racing so fast that she wondered if it might actually burst through her rib cage. The anxiety had become all-consuming, a tsunami of terror that threatened to sweep away everything that made her who she was. But then Max moved, and everything changed. The therapy dog positioned himself with surgical precision against Emma's trembling body. He didn't simply press against her leg as he had done countless times before. Instead, Max performed a complex series of movements that he had been specifically trained to execute in situations exactly like this one. He positioned his large, muscular body to create a physical boundary between Emma and the rest of the courtroom, essentially creating a safe space, a bubble of protection that isolated her from the overwhelming chaos surrounding them. Max's body was warm, radiating heat like a living furnace against Emma's cold, shaking form. The dog pressed his substantial weight against her legs, providing what therapists called deep pressure therapy, a technique that had been scientifically proven to calm anxiety and reduce the physical symptoms of panic attacks. The pressure of Max's body against hers seemed to ground Emma, to anchor her to physical reality when her mind was threatening to dissociate completely from her surroundings. But Max's intervention went far beyond simple physical pressure. The therapy dog began to move in a deliberate, rhythmic pattern, a series of undulating motions that forced Emma's erratic breathing to synchronize with his own steady, measured respiration. Max's entire body seemed to rise and fall in a pattern designed specifically to guide Emma's breathing back to normal. In through the nose, out through the mouth, matching the rhythm of the dog's movements. In, out, in, out. The motion was hypnotic, meditative, and absolutely essential to Emma's survival in that moment. Emma rested her forehead against Max's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of him, dog shampoo, fur, and home. Her tears, which had been building up inside her like floodwaters behind a failing dam, finally broke free. Great, heaving sobs racked her small body as she buried her face in Max's golden fur. But now, finally, she could cry. With Max's presence surrounding her, with his trained calming techniques working their magic, Emma could finally release the avalanche of emotion that had been building for 6 months. The courtroom had gone quiet. People had stood up from their seats, some moving toward the recess area, but many simply paused, frozen by the scene unfolding in the gallery. Emma's father and his lawyer exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emma's mother leaned forward, her own eyes welling with tears as she witnessed the profound connection between her daughter and the therapy dog. The court officers and administrative staff seemed uncertain whether to approach or maintain distance. Judge, however, did not return to her chambers for the recess. Instead, the judge remained in her position behind the bench, her gaze fixed entirely on the scene unfolding below her. The stern expression that had characterized her face throughout the morning had softened considerably. What Judge was witnessing transcended the typical dynamics of a custody hearing. She was observing something extraordinary, a demonstration of therapeutic intervention and unconditional love that no amount of legal argument could possibly replicate. The judge watched as Max continued his rhythmic movements, his body language projecting nothing but calm, protective dedication. She observed how the therapy dog's ears remained focused on Emma, how the dog's eyes tracked every movement of the girl's face, ready to adjust his response based on her continuing emotional state. This was not simply a dog comforting a child. This was a trained professional, a four-legged therapist, responding to a medical crisis with precision and expertise. Emma's crying intensified for several moments, but gradually, incrementally, it began to slow. The deep, gasping sobs transformed into quieter whimpers, then into occasional shuddering breaths. Max remained absolutely still, providing the stable, unchanging presence that Emma needed. The dog didn't try to distract her or move away. He simply remained there, a solid anchor in the tempest of her emotions. Judge noted something remarkable happening. Emma's breathing was actually returning to normal. The girl's face, which had been pale and grayish just moments before, was beginning to regain some color. The wild panic in her eyes was gradually being replaced by something calmer, more grounded. The transformation was not instantaneous, but it was undeniable. The therapy dog was literally healing Emma in real time, using techniques that had been carefully developed over months of training and practice. Emma's mother moved closer, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's back, but she didn't interrupt the connection between Emma and Max. She seemed to understand that this was a sacred moment, a demonstration of the profound bond that had sustained her daughter through the darkest period of her young life. Tears streamed down the mother's face as she observed the full extent of Max's importance to Emma's survival and well-being. Judge's expression had transformed completely from stern and impassive to deeply compassionate and thoughtful. She was seeing something that transcended custody evaluations and legal precedent. She was witnessing the tangible, physical manifestation of how essential Max was to Emma's mental health and emotional stability. The judge was seeing a truth that no custody assessment form could possibly capture, that separating this child from this dog would be catastrophic, not just emotionally, but potentially medically and psychologically. The therapy dog remained pressed against Emma, his presence constant and unwavering, as the courtroom watched in awed silence. This, Judge thought to herself, was what justice really looked like, not the victory of the wealthier parent or the more professionally accomplished adult, but the protection and preservation of what a child genuinely needed to survive and thrive. During the 15-minute recess, Judge did something highly unusual for a sitting judge in the middle of a custody hearing. Rather than retreating to her chambers to review documents or consult with her clerk, she approached Emma's mother directly in the hallway outside the courtroom. The judge's demeanor had shifted dramatically from the stern, impassive authority figure who had presided over the morning's proceedings. Now, there was a softness to her expression, a genuine concern that seemed to override the formal protocols that typically govern judicial behavior. Emma's mother was still in protective mode around her daughter, her arm wrapped securely around Emma's shoulders while Max sat at their feet, his presence providing continued grounding support. When the judge approached, Emma's mother immediately stood up, uncertain of what this unexpected interaction might mean. Judge studied them for a long moment before speaking, her voice notably gentler than it had been in the courtroom. "Tell me about the dog," Judge said simply, her question cutting directly to the heart of what she had witnessed. "I need to understand the role this animal plays in your daughter's life." Emma's mother seemed initially surprised by the directness of the question, but something in the judge's tone, a genuine curiosity rather than judicial interrogation, encouraged her to speak honestly. She began to explain Max's arrival in their lives, describing how the therapy dog had transformed Emma from a traumatized, withdrawn child into someone who could function, sleep, and occasionally smile despite the chaos of her parents' separation. "When my ex-husband left, Emma completely shut down," the mother explained, her voice wavering with emotion as she recounted the darkest days. "She stopped eating, she couldn't sleep, she had panic attacks at school, her teacher was worried she was developing depression, I was terrified I was losing her." The mother paused, looking down at Max with profound gratitude. "Then I got Max and everything changed. He's not just a pet, he's therapy, he's medicine, he's the reason Emma is still functioning." Judge listened intently, asking specific questions about Max's training, his behavioral responses, and the particular techniques that seemed most effective in managing Emma's anxiety. The mother explained the circular motion signal, the whispered words, the ritualistic nature of their communication. She described how Max seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense Emma's distress before it became critical, how he could intervene at precisely the right moment to prevent a panic attack from becoming completely debilitating. "Without Max, I honestly don't know if Emma would have survived these past 6 months," the mother said, tears beginning to stream down her face again. "He's not negotiable. If something separated them, I think it would break her completely." Judge made mental notes, filing away each piece of information as if it was a critical piece of evidence in an increasingly complex puzzle. She then asked for the school's contact information, stating that she wanted to speak with Emma's teacher and school counselor before proceeding any further with the hearing. Within an hour, Judge had arranged a telephone conference call with the school counselor, a dedicated woman named Doctor who had been working with Emma throughout the custody crisis. Doctor's account corroborated everything that Emma's mother had described. The counselor detailed Emma's dramatic decline in the months before Max's arrival, her academic performance plummeting, her social withdrawal, her apparent dissociation during classroom activities. Emma was on a very dangerous trajectory, Doctor explained, her professional voice laden with concern. Without intervention, I genuinely believe she was headed towards serious psychological disorders, but after Max arrived, I witnessed a transformation that frankly surprised me in its completeness. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it became manageable. Emma started participating in class again. Her grades improved significantly. She began eating her lunch instead of throwing it away untouched. Doctor went further, explaining that Max had become so integral to Emma's school functioning that the dog accompanied her to class several days per week with special accommodation from the school administration. Emma is fundamentally different when Max is present, the counselor stated. She's calmer, more focused, more able to engage with her peers. The dog provides a form of therapeutic support that no amount of traditional counseling could replicate. Judge then requested access to Emma's complete therapeutic file, including all psychological evaluations, progress notes, and assessments conducted since the custody proceedings began. She spent the remainder of the recess carefully reviewing these documents, her judicial mind synthesizing the information into a coherent understanding of Emma's psychological state and needs. The therapeutic assessments were remarkably consistent in their findings. Emma had been diagnosed with anxiety disorder secondary to parental separation trauma. The evaluations noted that the child had demonstrated significant improvement in symptom management since the introduction of the therapy dog. More importantly, the assessments made a critical observation. The therapeutic relationship between Emma and Max appeared to be the single most effective intervention in her psychological treatment plan. One assessment, prepared by a clinical psychologist named Doctor, was particularly illuminating. Doctor had observed Emma both with and without Max present during his evaluation sessions. His notes documented dramatic differences in Emma's presentation across these two conditions. With Max present, Emma demonstrated near-normal anxiety levels and was able to engage in therapeutic dialogue. Without Max, Emma's anxiety escalated to crisis levels within minutes. Doctor's conclusion was unambiguous. This child has formed a therapeutic attachment to the canine service animal that is essential to her continued psychological functioning. Disruption of this attachment would likely result in significant psychological deterioration and could potentially trigger severe anxiety episodes or depressive symptoms. The therapy dog is not a luxury or an optional companionship animal. From a clinical perspective, Max functions as essential medical equipment for this child's mental health. As Judge finished reading Doctor's assessment, something crystallized in her mind, a fundamental shift in how she understood this case. This was no longer simply a custody battle between two competing parents. This was a situation in which a child's fundamental psychological survival depended on maintaining her connection to a specific therapeutic animal. Judge realized with startling clarity that she had been approaching this case through entirely the wrong lens. She had been unconsciously influenced by the father's lawyer's arguments about financial resources and professional accomplishment. She had been evaluating parental fitness based on the kinds of metrics that mattered in business and professional contexts, but that were fundamentally irrelevant to a child's actual. The real question was not which parent could provide more money or better opportunities. The real question was which parent understood Emma's actual needs and could ensure that those needs were consistently met. Emma needed stability. Emma needed her mother. Emma needed Max, and those three things were inextricably linked. Judge realized that she had witnessed something profound in the courtroom that morning. Not just a girl and her dog, but a child communicating her deepest truth through the only language that could express it. The language of authentic emotional connection and unconditional love. The judge had seen what no custody evaluation form or financial statement could possibly capture. The raw reality of what Emma actually needed to survive and thrive. As the recess drew to a close, Judge felt the weight of her responsibility in a new and different way. She was no longer simply arbitrating between two parents. She was protecting a child who had already suffered so much. And that protection could not be compromised by the professional accomplishments or financial capabilities of the wealthier parent. When the courtroom reconvened after the 15-minute recess, the atmosphere had fundamentally transformed. The tension that had permeated the space earlier seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a palpable sense of anticipation and changed circumstances. Judd took her seat behind the bench with a different demeanor than she had displayed that morning. Her expression was no longer stern and impassive. Instead, there was a clarity in her eyes, a sense of purpose and conviction that suggested she had arrived at a decision rooted in something deeper than legal precedent or procedural convention. Emma sat between her mother and Max, her small body still trembling slightly from the aftermath of her panic attack, but noticeably calmer than she had been. Max remained pressed against her leg, a living reminder that she was not alone, that she had an advocate in the form of a loyal companion who loved her unconditionally. Emma's mother placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, and for the first time since entering the courthouse that morning, Emma felt the smallest glimmer of hope. Judge surveyed the courtroom briefly, her gaze settling momentarily on each participant, the father and his lawyer, Emma's mother and her legal representative, and finally, with lingering attention, on Emma and Max. When she began to speak, her voice carried a weight and authority that commanded absolute attention. This was not the procedural reading of a standard custody ruling. This was something far more significant. I have reviewed all the evidence presented today, including the custody evaluations, psychological assessments, school records, and therapeutic reports. Judge began, her words measured and deliberate. However, I must acknowledge that the most compelling evidence presented to this court was not contained in any file or document. The most compelling evidence was witnessed by me personally in this very courtroom this morning. The father's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that the ruling was not going to favor his client. Judge continued, her eyes never leaving Emma and Max as she spoke. I observed a child in significant psychological distress, a child experiencing what appeared to be a severe anxiety attack. I observed that same child communicate with her therapy dog through a sophisticated system of nonverbal signals that they have clearly developed together over an extended period. I observed the dog respond to that communication with trained precision and therapeutic expertise. What I witnessed was not simply a pet providing comfort. I witnessed a therapeutic relationship that has become essential to this child's mental health and functioning. Judge paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. She then addressed the father directly, her tone respectful but firm. I recognize that the petitioner has demonstrated financial stability and professional accomplishment. However, custody determinations cannot be based solely on financial resources or professional credentials. Custody determinations must be based on the best interests of the child. And in this case, the best interests of Emma are clear and unambiguous. The judge turned her attention to Emma's mother. The respondent has demonstrated unwavering commitment to her daughter's emotional well-being. She has ensured that Emma receives appropriate therapeutic support. She has maintained consistent employment and provided a stable home environment. Most importantly, she has ensured that Emma maintains her essential connection to her therapy dog, a connection that has become medically and psychologically necessary for this child's continued functioning. Judge's ruling came swiftly and definitively. I am awarding primary custody of Emma to her mother. The father will receive supervised visitation twice per month, with visitation to be scheduled and supervised by a court-appointed representative. The supervision is necessary to ensure that Emma's emotional needs are protected and that visitation does not exacerbate her anxiety disorder. The judge then did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Emma, her stern judicial expression softening into something warm and almost grandmotherly. "Emma, I want you to know something," Judge said gently, breaking the formal protocols of courtroom procedure. "That dog loves you very much. He showed me today how much he cares about you. Your mother understands how important Max is to you. That's one of the reasons she's the right person to be your primary guardian. She knows that you need him. She knows that he helps you feel safe and loved, and that matters. That matters more than anything else in this courtroom." Emma felt tears stream down her face, but these were different tears, tears of relief, tears of release, tears that represented the breaking of the storm that had been battering her for 6 months. Her mother pulled her close, embracing her daughter with fierce protectiveness and profound gratitude. Max pressed even closer, his entire body seeming to vibrate with the emotional intensity of the moment. Judge continued, addressing both parents but with her primary focus on establishing parameters that would protect Emma. "I am ordering that any future modifications to this custody arrangement be contingent upon the child's continued access to her therapy dog. I am further ordering that Emma's therapy dog, Max, is to remain in the primary residence with Emma at all times. The dog is not a possession to be divided. The dog is an essential component of this child's medical and psychological care." The father sat stunned, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His lawyer began shuffling papers, clearly considering options for appeal, but Judge's ruling had been so thoroughly reasoned and so clearly based on Emma's actual needs that any appeal seemed futile. The judge had not simply made a decision. She had made a statement about what justice actually means when children are involved. "Court is adjourned," Judge declared, her gavel striking the bench with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like a bell announcing a new beginning. Emma's mother immediately gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her as if she might disappear. Emma clung to her mother while simultaneously gripping Max's collar, unwilling to break the connection with either of them. Around them, people began moving, the court officers clearing documents, the lawyer for the father packing up his briefcase with visible frustration, the court clerk returning to administrative duties. But Emma was aware of none of this. Her entire universe had compressed into 3 entities, her mother, herself, and Max. The nightmare was over. The uncertainty had been replaced with clarity. The terrifying prospect of being torn away from her mother and her dog had been replaced with the certainty of remaining together. As they stood to leave the courtroom, Emma's mother began to cry, tears of gratitude and relief. She looked down at her daughter and then at Max, shaking her head in amazement at the profound role the therapy dog had played in saving her family. They walked together down the marble hallway of the courthouse, Emma's small hand held firmly in her mother's grip, while Max walked beside them, his tail wagging with what seemed like pure joy. The courthouse doors opened, and golden afternoon sunlight flooded over them. Emma stepped out into that warmth and light, feeling for the first time in 6 months that she could actually breathe freely. Behind them, Judge watched from the courthouse window as the small family descended the steps, a mother, a daughter, and a golden retriever whose love had proven more powerful than any legal argument or financial credential. The judge smiled to herself, knowing that she had made the right decision. Sometimes, the most important judgments had nothing to do with law and everything to do with recognizing and protecting what was truly essential to human survival and happiness. Emma looked up at her mother and then down at Max, her heart finally allowing itself to believe that everything was going to be okay. They were together. They were safe. And most importantly, they were never going to be separated. That was all the justice Emma needed.